Scot McKnight and Beth Allison Barr, thank you so much for joining us again on A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk Into a Bar.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you to be back, and good to see Beth again.
Yeah, I feel like you guys have an excuse to hang out and catch up a little bit. And you guys are both breaking your own record of guests on our show. We have never had anyone more than once besides each of you.
That's really fun. Well, I send out the last podcast we did all the time to people who are like, tell me about Bible translations. And I'm like, look, here you are. And I just send it out.
Yeah. Didn't we actually see that Professor Lipscomb is using that as course material?
Yeah. So that's exciting.
Super fun. Well, we'll hopefully give them more material tonight. Beth, since we last spoke, you announced that just last week, I think, that you're turning The Making of Biblical Womanhood into a trilogy, which is incredible. And I'm so excited to be able to read that and for you to share that with the world. Can you give us a brief preview maybe of the next two books, and even if you have a timeline?
Yeah. So no, I do. So I don't know. I can't remember if this is a video or not, but you can see the empty bookshelves behind me. And that's because I'm moving offices right now, because I'm moving into a chaired position in history, which means I have more time to write. I'm moving out of my dean position and into a chair position. And so once I realized I was going to be doing that at Baylor, I got serious with Brazos about thinking about new projects. And so I had two that I had sort of been tossing around, and they were more than amenable to thinking about two more books to put with The Making of Biblical Womanhood. So the second book that I'm going to do is called Becoming the Pastor's Wife. And this is something I've been thinking about for a while, but I couldn't get the right angle on it because, I'm a medieval historian. And so if I'm telling the story that's only 300 years old, I'm like, that's not a story. That's not very long. So, but what I began thinking about as I began toying and reading this idea of the pastor's wife, I suddenly realized that the story of the beginning of the pastor's wife kind of begins when the story about female ordination also changes. And so I began thinking about how those two things are linked. So becoming a pastor's wife is actually the story of female ordination from the ancient world through the early modern world and the rise of the pastor's wife to the modern time. So I'm really excited about it. It's giving me an excuse to go get into the Dorothy Patterson archives up at Southwestern. So Scott's laughing. I cannot wait to get into those and see her class material. And then the third book is one that I've also been thinking about for a long time. And it's called Losing Our Medieval Religion. So clearly I'm a child of the 90s, and Losing Our Medieval Religion continues my thought that part of our problem as modern evangelical Christians is that we are too short-sighted in our history. And that because we are so short-sighted, that we have caused ourselves a lot of problems, unnecessary problems. And so I'm going to walk through some contemporary issues and parallel them with the medieval past and talk about what we've forgotten.
So obviously the second book will the third book deal primarily with gender issues in the church historically, or is it just going to be
It'll be broad. Yeah, it'll be broad. I have all sorts of things. I've actually been blogging on a few of these on the Anxious Bench. I have one actually that's actually called Losing Our Medieval Religion, in which I was really irritated when I found out that the SAT was considering dropping all of its pre-Reformation history questions. And I was like, and so I was like, what happens when our history becomes so short? And so that's when I really began thinking about it. But no, there's all sorts of things. I can't wait for my chapter on the papacy, on the medieval papacy, and compare that to some modern pastors. And that's going to be fun.
You
Nice.
mean to say some modern pastors might see themselves as popes?
Well, authorities an interesting thing, but yes, there are some really fascinating parallels.
As a matter of fact,
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah,
Can't wait.
it'll be fun.
And do you have a rough timeline at all?
Oh, I forgot about that. 2024 for Becoming the Pastor's Wife, and 2026 for Losing Our Medieval Religion.
Wow.
Nice.
Wow, fun. And if you haven't checked out Beth's stuff on Anxious Bench, it's prolific and it's really, really good. If you're looking for more Beth Allison Barr, which you should be, it's there and it's fun. Scott, what are you up to? What have you been up to? Have you writing anything? You told us last about your translation of the New Testament coming out soon.
Yes, the translation has gone through spasms since I submitted it. We've had glitches in the editorial process. So yesterday, I was actually informed that most of it has been read by an editor, and I'll be able to start seeing what suggestions they have and put them into the final manuscript and then send it on. I mean, then it'll be ready to start going to copy, whatever you want to call it, copy editors.
Mm-hmm.
Translations are hard to edit because, and mine is peculiar translation, because the editor's job is normally to help you improve your English or to make it clear, whatever. And this they have to stay out of because it's clunky. Greek into English can be clunky. And when we just take English translations and take the Greek New Testament and turn it into as good of English as we can make it, we're going to lose something about the Greek in the process.
Yeah.
And I'm irritated enough with translations that we've begun to lose too many things with how familiar we've become with our own language. So that's going, but I'm Randy, you may know, I'm doing a 16-volume series of everyday study Bible guides for sort of like Tom Wright's Bible for Everyone.
Yep.
And 2 of those are out. Acts was the publication date was today. And I've submitted Philippians and 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. They're going to the printer.
Wow.
And I'm just about done with the Gospel of John.
Oh, fun.
Wow. So yeah, you've been busy.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is I have a book on Revelation coming out next year.
Oh, really? You're tackling
You said
Revelation?
that's going to derail the rest of our conversation. Don't say anything about Revelation.
I can't. Oh, wow. That's great. I
Called
can't wait for that
Revelation
one.
for the rest of us.
Nice.
Fun.
Is it really?
Yes, Revelation for the rest of us.
So here's the most important question now, Scott. Are you pre-trib, post-trib, or amillennial? Good. You're laughing. Thank you. All right.
This is a theopolitical reading of Revelation. It's
Amen.
really about reading Revelation backwards through the lens of Babylon in chapter 18.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I love Revelation so much. Scott, this is just the Bible geek in me. Do you have a favorite epistle?
Epistle?
Mm-hmm.
I have favorite Gospels.
What's your favorite Gospels then?
Matthew.
Uh-huh.
Really?
Oh, that was not what I expected. Interesting.
Why?
Look, this was what my whole life until 10 years ago when I came to Northern. I had never taught Paul until I taught at Rome, at Northern as a course. So, no, I was a gospel specialist
That's right.
for 30 years.
Fun. And why would you say Matthew's your favorite?
I don't know. I fell in love with Matthew when I was a seminary first year student. And it's been with me ever since.
Love it. I just don't understand the people who say that Mark's their favorite. Like, I know Mark was probably the first.
It's the shortest.
The shortest.
The shortest. That's why, they can read it more quickly.
Oh, you're saying that's a good thing. Got it. Okay. All right.
That's what I'm saying. It's the shortest. So that's why because it's the one that they've read all the way through, because,
Yeah. Fun.
So if you have Matthew and Luke, you don't even need Mark.
There you go.
Nice.
So it's kind of a segue into talking about translations, which is what spurred this whole conversation. I'm just curious, what is the peer review process like for publishing a translation? Do you have other translators look at it? How's that work? Because you're going to disagree about all of it, right?
Not really. No, I mean, I have paid attention to other people's translations. Like I use the Baylor Handbook to the Greek New Testament religiously for each volume. and they all provide their own translations on the basis of the Greek text. So there was a lot of help there for me. And I paid attention to other translations during the process as well. So no, it's not going to be, so far as I know, they're not going to send it out to somebody else to see what they think.
Mm-hmm.
So, even the editors, the editors have said, I'm not sure about this word. I said, this word is used 79 times in the New Testament. When you look up every one of those references, then you can tell me whether you think
they're not going. I think there's something to say too about being an established scholar on different things and the level, if I think if Scott was recently out of his PhD and he wanted to do a Bible translation, I suspect, first of all, they wouldn't do it.
Yeah,
and secondly, I don't think they would do it, but it would probably also have a much more, anyway, that's an interesting thing about how peer review works. So,
Scott, would you say that this translation is kind of your pinnacle work, or do you not see it that way?
Well, okay, here's how this translation, I don't know if I've said this before with you guys. John Goldengate's translation came out, and I read it and I loved it. All right. It's sad. Not many people are paying attention to it. And I don't know why. It is so good. And it was bound in England with Tom Wright's Kingdom New Testament. And the difference between these two translations theory is dramatic. Tom's just got, this flowing English and paraphrastic similarities and analogy. This is what it sounded like in Greek, and this is what it sounds like. Goldengate, transliterates all the Hebrew names. So you feel like you're reading a Hebrew text in some ways. Well, I told the editor at InterVarsity, John Boyd, I said, John, Tom Wright's translation doesn't belong with John Goldengate's. These are two different theories. He said, what do you think it should happen? I said, it should be one that is based like Goldengate on a more literal reading. And he said, would you like to do it? And I said, yeah, I hadn't even thought of it, but I thought, yeah, I'd like to do it.
That's fun.
So I started working on it. So the idea is, there's sometimes I'm going to venture outside the fence and try to give some, let's say, analogies or equivalents, dynamic equivalents. But I do a lot of much more literal translation, and it will prove that the ESV is no more literal than the NIV.
Oh, shots fired. All right.
And mine will be far more literal than either one of them.
Nice.
So it was a lot of fun. And yes, it's a pinnacle to get to do this. But I wanted to do this because our English translations are so Englishy and so Americanish that people don't even realize that this is from another world and another time. So I wanted to kind of bring people back to the first century.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to that, Scott.
Yep. Can't wait.
I'll send it to you, Beth.
I know. I'm using his Acts study already because he sent it to me early. So anyway,
That's
I'm
awesome.
ordering the books though.
So speaking of transitions, what for both of you, what are the most common misconceptions that you found church folks have about Bible translations, and what do you say in response?
So, I think you kind of, with thinking about the translation process, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about how translation processes take place. And also, I think a lot about like the KJV Bible translation process. And for a long time, there was this narrative that all of the 50 translators that were pulled together by really Richard Bancroft, but by King James, to take on this, translation, and that they worked together in this perfect harmony all together and came out, with this inspired, as some believe, at least authorized version of the Bible. But the fact is that the KJV was done, it was very individualized by the people who were doing it. And there was a lot of arguments about words, and there were parts of it that none of the other translators ever saw. And so there was it was much more piecemeal than we think. And it reflecting a lot of different personalities, like the Bible reflects a lot of personalities. And then you have these translation committees that often, their personalities also come through. So I think, when you think about like the ESV's claim that it is the best translation, that it is the most literal translation of the Bible. And then you think about how all of these, these different personalities who all have maybe a different understanding of what literal means, coming together and producing what they think in their parts is the most literal, and you pull these together. I mean, it's not as pure as I think we want to think it is. And I think this makes us trust Bibles. I don't want to say the Bible's not trustworthy, so nobody go off and say that I said the Bible wasn't trustworthy, but I think it makes us trust versions much more than maybe we should. I think we should always approach Bible translations with caution and thinking about who they are, who is behind them, and paying attention to how things change. So I would, and of course, y'all know my response to that is I tell people to use multiple versions of the Bible, multiple translations of the Bible, so that they can compare across and see what differences there are in the verses.
And Beth touched on one of the things that's important to me is people ask me, what's the best translation? There is no such thing. But people then get stuck on a translation, which is a good thing, I suppose. And then they think it's the best because it's the one they know, and they compare it to others. And the next thing you know, their pastor uses one, and other people in the church whom they respect or honor or who have authority, they all use that one. The next thing you know, it becomes tribal. Right. So there's such a tribalism about translations that is, to me, is dangerous. And I say this all the time, but most people who give their opinions about translations know nothing about what they're talking about. I mean, how do you assess someone's translation of the book of Acts who has never read the book of Acts in Greek?
Yep.
Because that is one difficult book for normal New Testament people to translate. It's full of language that no one else knows about or no one else uses. And it's sophisticated. The pastoral epistles are the same way, very sophisticated. And that touches on something that Beth is bringing up. I'm trying, and I think it's more difficult than I thought it would be, to give the feel for the different authors of the New Testament. For instance, Matthew and Mark write a very similar Greek. Mark got a B in class, and Matthew got a B plus. Luke got an A. John didn't go to class. He was in some monastery out there doing his own thing.
That's my man right there.
And there's a sensibility about these translations or these texts that need to be conveyed in the translations themselves, because the goal of most translations is to turn it all into a form of English that people are familiar with in our churches. For instance, the NIV wants to use vocabulary that is known 12th grade and below. Well, there are words in the Gospel of Luke and in the book of Acts and in the book of Hebrews that are not known by people in 12th grade. But what are we going to do? Are we going to flatten that sophistication out? And so I think I've tried. So I've used a couple words that most people are going to say, well, I have to look it up. And I want to say to them, well, probably some people had to look up the word that Luke used because they didn't know they had not heard that word before. So I think the big issue is the sensibility that we're going to have the best translation. these translations that we talk about, the NRSV, the RSV behind it, the NIV, the TNIV, the ESV, these are good translations. The New Living Translation, they're good. They do a good job at what they're trying to do. And and there are going to be reliable translations for people to use in the church. So, and one of the things that I saw this in a church I used to attend, whose initials are Willow Creek. That people would put up on the board, they'd put up on their massive screen, they would put up a different translation and say, I use this one because I think it's better. And I thought to myself, you have no idea what you're talking. In other words, we don't choose a translation because we like what it says, but because it is faithful and accurate to the original language.
Yeah.
So that's okay. I gave it.
I just have to say, as a pastor, thank you, Jesus, that Scot McKnight isn't part of my church. Because gosh, would I be insecure all the time.
Just wait till you had me analyzing your sermon structure.
Oh gosh. Don't ever do that. Don't ever.
That's a sermon structure.
That's what a lot of people say.
Yep.
So in our last conversation, it's come up a couple times here too as well. Biblical translation committees came up. Mm-hmm. This is one of those things that if you look in the preface of your Bible, you might find that it's a thing, but most people don't even think about it. So right. I bet a lot of listeners probably don't even know they exist. This might be the first time they've ever thought about it. So can you tell us a little bit about how they work, maybe demystify them a little bit? How have they worked historically? How do they work today?
You want to start, Scott?
Well, yeah, I was involved in translating Luke for the New Living Translation. And actually another translation before that nobody knows about, the New Century Version, I think it's called.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But what I did is I sort of translated Luke. We were kind of given the Living Bible. It was originally going to be a revision of the Living Bible. So we had to make suggestions on top of it. And then there were three of us who did Luke. So then my friend and my teacher, and then my colleague, Grant Osborne, then collated the various suggestions to the translation and then put them together in a translation. And then that was worked out with the New Testament committee. And then Daniel Taylor, who is an amazing English professor at Bethel, who wrote a great book called The Myth of Certainty, he turned it into good prose. And then it kind of worked with the committee. Now, the NIV committee, the original translators were like given specific books, and then they began to, as a committee, like there were a dozen of them, that began to talk with one another. And now every year, I believe the NIV translation committee, I think it's called the Committee for Bible Translation, and it's guided by Douglas Moo. They meet once a year for every suggestion that they've seen during the year. And they go over them painstakingly. So
that's interesting.
These and Beth is right about the King James. I wrote about this one time. I gave a paper about the King James. That was a polemically started Bible. They wanted to defeat the Puritans.
Geneva, yeah, the Geneva Bible.
And they did have some really good specialists who translated things, but it was largely done by an individual, each book.
Right. Yeah. And they did. And it was as much politically driven as it was, I guess, a concern about the text driven. Yeah. And I think that's something that when people think about translations, you got to think about the motivations behind them. And so I think, and some people, they're like, well, how do we get at the motivations? And some of that you can just, often you can Google, why did somebody decide to do a new translation? What was needed about it? Was there like the NRSV? Part of the NRSV was because everybody objected so much to the RSV, where they took out, changed virgin to young woman. And talking about Mary and Isaiah. And so part of, was, and so that was very controversial when the RSV came out. And so that's part of the reason why they did the NRSV. So you just got to think, and it's not that that's a bad thing. It's just know why. Why did they do it? Why did they suddenly decide there needed to be a new Bible translation? What's going on? And a lot of it is actually just modernizing language. A lot of, they're like, people need to have a language that they can relate to. And so that, I think, drives a lot of it, is trying to bring it to a larger audience. So I think, when we think about, I mean, I still just give that advice all the time, is just know who translated it and figure out why they did it, at least as best as you can.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of them aren't going to tell you. The NIV was sort of a updated. I mean, people had just gotten to the point where the King James was no longer working.
Right.
So it was a fairly neutral reason, a good reason. The ESV is the RSV was John Piper's Bible and Wayne Grudem's Bible. And when the NRSV came out, tied, to the feminist movement,
right, gender inclusivity,
and inclusive language, they got irritated by it, and they actually got rights to the old RSV because it was being discontinued, and then they edited it, and only 9% of the words of the ESV are not identical to the old RSV. So the ESV is basically a revised version of the RSV, and some of it has some motives that some of us don't think was the best of motives for having.
You covered those in our last conversation.
I'm going to bring up a sensitive name around here with from you, Beth, but that was said on Twitter. Like your quote, Scott, basically of only 9% of the ESV is original, and the rest is kind of basically the RSV. And Denny Burke said that's basically every translation we have, just so you know, and wrote that off really quickly. What would your response be to that?
I can guarantee you that Denny Burke has not done any statistics on all these other translations. That was a dismissal rather than an intelligent remark. But that statement of 9% came from Wayne Grudem. And it is simply not true that the NIV is 9% different than some other translation. There is no translation like it.
Right.
In 1984. So, and the NLT was originally going to be a revision of the Living Bible, but it's completely different. So Denny Burke was just blowing smoke.
He's pretty good at that.
I don't see anything from him anymore. I muted him, and I guess I muted. And so it's been so wonderful.
So peaceful on Twitter.
Nice. Well, so maybe we'll stir some things up again with him.
Yeah, right. So Beth, related to what you just said, something similar came up in the last time we spoke. You recommended that people read the prefaces in their Bibles, right? And one of the things they'll find there are these translation committees, but you also said that they should look into what's influencing the translators. And you mentioned, find out where they went to school, where they got their degrees, who they studied with, so you can kind of discern what their biases might be. So one of the things I think about a lot, and I've been writing about recently, is expertise.
Yeah.
In particular, how difficult it can be to discern who the expert is when you're not an expert yourself. So for example, if one of us were asked to identify which of two people with PhDs in organic chemistry was the more expert, most people wouldn't have any idea where to start, right?
Yeah.
They'd almost have to choose at random. They shouldn't be at all confident in their choice. And I think something similar is probably true with the world of translation and biblical expertise. So I know this is a hard question because I run my head against it regularly. But I'm curious if either of you have any advice for somebody in that position. So let's say they take your advice, they look in the preface of their ESV or NIV or CEV or whatever. They Google the people they find there. They find out where they went to school. They look at their publication records. And then they sit back and think, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, I have no idea how to judge. Each of them have a community behind them that thinks they're authoritative. So in other words, how do they know who to trust?
So, I do this a lot. I teach, when I would teach historians craft, what history is. and why you do it. One of the things that I teach students how to do is to recognize scholars. Like, when are you dealing with a book that is written by that's peer reviewed and written by a scholar? When are you dealing with a book that is maybe popular, did not go through peer review, doesn't have, the person behind it doesn't have very many credentials in it, et cetera? How do you do that really quickly? And so some of the things that I tell them, I'm like, is it published by an academic press? Look and see if it's published by an academic press. You could also very quickly go and Google that press and see what their peer review process is. Oftentimes in the beginning of the book, you can look and you can see who was on the committee who helped, the editorial board that helped approve that book. And all of those things can give you clues about the credibility of the author. It doesn't mean that you can't read books that aren't done by academics. It's just understanding the difference between those. And with your chemistry example, organic chemistry, I'm not an organic chemist. But what I would do is I would go to the university webpage of both of the two organic chemists, and I would see who was actually had a lab that had a lot of people in it that was actually actively working. And usually they have a list of all of their publications. And in science labs, they churn out publications pretty quickly, and they're out there all the time. So who is actually doing the research, and where are they getting published? Versus people who maybe are an organic chemist, but they got their PhD in 1959 and haven't done any research since 1975 and aren't actively working in a lab. There's a difference when you think about who is maybe citing and talking about more authoritatively about the most recent research. So I think you can apply some of those same skills to thinking about who these people are. We think about I entered the world of Bible translations through Bruce Metzger. And I still really like reading, his book on Bible translations is still one that I really like, on the history, how did we get the Bible, so to speak. And Bruce Metzger, of course, if you go look him up, you will immediately see how credentialed that he is. His active publication record really up until almost his death, and how involved he was in the many translation committees. And so, that just simply gives you a clue. How active are they in research? How active are they in their field? And more active scholars at least are more engaged in the conversations and make them more current. So is that a little bit helpful? I'll let Scott weigh in.
Well, you're right. And I think on Bible translation committees, it would be an enormous amount of work to find out how all of them.
Yes.
There could be 15, 20 people. That's a lot of people to investigate. But like the NIV or the ESV, you're going to find these people who are all gathered in evangelical schools. They're not Bruce Metzger at Princeton, And Bruce Metzger was a brilliant, godly, super brilliant man, and he was really careful. I think the question that you asked is the right one. Who do you trust? Mm-hmm. All right, this is a very important point for ordinary people when they choose a Bible. Mm-hmm. If they trust you and you tell them the NIV is the best translation, they believe you and they go with it, and that becomes their Bible, and that becomes the Word of God to them. Mm-hmm. So it's important. So I would say we have to ask the question, who do I want to trust? But I want to ask another question connected to it, and that is, do they know this subject? There are a lot of pastors who have opinions about everything, from the Democrats to the decision or this new policy or thing that's been leaked by Justice Alito. They have opinions about everything, but that does not make them knowledgeable. So I'd want to ask someone on translations who actually can read the text in the original language. And I want to ask them, the people who can, who are not just blowhards, will tell you that they'll be honest with you and say, almost all these translations are reliable. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They're not going to tell you that I like to blow smoke at the ESV, but it's a reliable translation. Yep. I disagree with some things, I disagree with the NIV, and I'm going through it painstakingly now with these 16 volumes. Every passage, I'm checking, and I've already been through it in the last, when I translated the New Testament. So I want to find some people who really know what they're talking about, and I want to get them to give me some judgments. And I think we can be confident that the major translations out there are reliable, but not infallible.
Yes.
So
that's great, Scott.
We need to check out some other translations. I'm nervous about tribalism because before long, that's the only Bible that matters. And when that happens, you got people saying things that don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I tell, and I've written about this with the ESV too, because it's just a really prime example of it. But if the people you're looking at, if they're only in each other's circles, if their circle of scholarship is very small, like, think about some of the translation committees. If there are people from different denominations, from different seminaries representing some intellectual diversity, as well as other types of diversity, which are really important too, that can tell you something. Whereas if they are all people who are only drinking from the same cup,
especially
and
Kool-Aid.
Yeah. Especially if it's Kool-Aid. Yeah.
So for both of you then, if that's the case, which makes perfect sense, do you know of translations that have done that, to have pulled from a wider academic background and ecumenical maybe even?
There's two. There's only two.
Only two. I'll be quiet then until Scott speaks.
The NIV is almost entirely white males with some women. All right. The ESV, I think we know what that reflects. All right. The Common English Bible, the CEB, had intellectual diversity, gender diversity, some ethnic diversity. And the other one is the new NRSV UE. It looks like NRS View, VUE, but it's a little U and a little E. And it's the new revision of the NRSV. But I've just been told, I don't know that this is true, but I think it's true, is that they were only permitted to make one change per page.
Really?
So it's a slight revision, but it has amazing diversity on it. And I'm going to have to, my TA actually I wrote a commentary on the pastoral epistles in the last few years, and for Cambridge, and we did it on the NRSV, but then they told us we had to use the NRSV UE, and my TA went through it and found it, and there were hardly any changes. So it isn't real significant. I think when you look at diversity, you're looking at the CEB and the NRSV. That's the only translations, in my opinion, that have that kind of diversity. Although I think both of them are very mainline-ish as well, which lacks some of the diversity that it could have. But there's no evangelical publisher that has anything like intellectual diversity at the ecumenical level. They're all evangelicals.
Sure. Yeah. So with respect to,
yes, they are.
I know. It's just funny the way you use no intellectual diversity. It's funny. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's what you would expect, right? Not much demographic diversity either.
That is true. I mean, that's the other thing, are all these people like from the same geographical area, trained by the same schools, all going to the same conference and not going to other conferences? That always is a mark to me.
Yeah.
Like they're all going to the same conference every year and only hearing each other's papers. Yeah. And I'm like, that's very small intellectual circles. So.
Right. Yeah. That's how echo chambers get formed. Yeah. So with respect to, discerning genuine expertise, I think what you guys were saying is jived with a lot of what we said on this podcast and what we've talked with other experts about. And one of the marks, I think, it's not foolproof, but one of the marks of genuine expertise is a kind of intellectual humility. Now, this is not always the case. There are certainly lots of arrogant experts out there. But in general, most experts will be honest with you about the merits of people who disagree with them. And they'll be honest with you about the place that their position takes in the broader discussion. We were just talking with Craig Keener recently, and almost every question we asked him about the Bible, he prefaced with, now I'm in the minority here. There are lots of people who disagree with me about this. And he wanted to make sure that we knew that up front. That's a mark of a humble person. And I think humility is something that you naturally acquire in the kind of environment where expertise is formed. You have to kind of resist it because you're constantly shown the limits of your own knowledge in that kind of environment.
Yeah, I always tell my students that the further I progressed in my PhD, the more I realized how little I actually knew.
Right.
And by the time you finish it, you're like, I know nothing, because you realize how limited your knowledge is.
And I think there's another side to that too. The flip side of it is, look, you and I have to make decisions, Beth. We look through historical sources and we go, okay, this is what I think is going on. And we say it.
Right.
At that point, though, we know that what we have given to people is a let's say a hypothesis, a theory, a statement, and it can be challenged. And so willingness to be challenged is and to engage in that kind of conversation, although there are some conversations that I'm just not going to engage about some of this stuff, but because it's a waste of time. It's not a conversation. It's they're trying to get gotcha moments. So I think that we also propose things and we can state it with absolute clarity and conviction, not certainty, but conviction, and then say, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Yep. That's exactly right.
One of my favorite New Testament scholars, I think he's the most knowledgeable man I've ever been around. His name is Dale Allison. And he writes amazing stuff. And I've said, Dale, I'm not sure about that. And he'll go, well, I could be wrong. I thought, you got 74 footnotes on this. You've read a lot more than I have on it. And I've read 25 of those footnotes.
Yeah.
And so he's willing to say, oh, I could be wrong on that. I think that's what's important.
Yeah. So we've got a bunch of questions from Twitter, which we're going to get to in just a second. Before we do that, I'm just curious, and this kind of came up on Twitter too. We've talked a lot about the ESV. We focused on that last time we spoke. Is there any other translations that are conspicuously or problematically biased in a similar way that people should be aware of?
Well, I've said, I think the ESV is biased in, let's say, in the 9%. That old 91% of the RSV was, I loved the RSV. I used it all the time until the NRSV came out. And I also used the NIV. I used the Bible the congregation I'm speaking at uses. For instance, I think all translations are, they lean the direction the author leans, or the committee leans, and no one's upright. Okay. I think that's from E.B. White somewhere. For instance, I'm irritated right now by the NIV's decision on the Greek word ergon, which means work. And in the plural, ergon means works. All right. When they think it is Christian behavior, they translate the word deeds. But when Paul got a little bit of problem with it, they translate it works. Now the word works is entirely negative in the New Testament. And that is I would call that a biased translation of this Greek word, because Paul used the same word for good deeds and for works that he didn't approve of. Why do we need to split that in half? Because there's something about works that can go in two directions, but when you use two different words, you're not going to get that. But I go back. I do give the ESV a lot of grief, but it's a reliable translation.
So I'm more big picture here. So one of the things that I think is, when we think about English Bible translations in the first half, really in the middle part of the 20th century, we're going to see a lot more gender bias in them. There's a lot less willingness to recognize Junia. There is a lot less willingness to recognize Phoebe as a deacon. There's a lot more emphasis on in Timothy, the male pronouns that make it seem like the overseer is a man instead of them being more gender neutral. So you're going to see those within the cultural context of the 20th century US. And as a historian, I find that fascinating. And it's not that they're sketchy translations, it's that they are reflecting a very clear cultural bias and a way of portraying women. And so there's a lot of similarities. Like I grew up on the NIV 1984, and it is more gender biased. And so I think that is something I kind of like to group translations. The other thing to think about is differences between Catholic translations and Protestant translations. And Catholics and Protestants have a very different understanding of authority, as well as ecclesiastical leadership. And so you're going to see some interesting differences in those. And so thinking about too, is this a Catholic translation? And there's a lot of overlap too between it, but thinking about that too, what are Protestant translations and what are Catholic translations, and comparing those. I think everybody should have a Catholic translation around, and vice versa. I also like to keep the Apocrypha around. Up until the 17th, 18th century, the Apocrypha was in most Bibles. And, it's not until we took it out. And so that too, we're losing a big chunk of Christian history when we don't pay attention to the Apocrypha. So that didn't directly answer your question, but maybe it indirectly helped.
That's fun. I just quoted the Apocrypha in a sermon for the first time 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Reading medieval sermons, I sometimes would forget who was actually, like Susanna. I realized, I was like, oh, actually Susanna's in the Apocrypha, because I would read it so much and I would just think about her as a biblical woman. And then I would realize that, oh, actually, there's, but medieval Christians wouldn't have really seen a difference. And even early modern Christians, Susanna became a figure that was used by early modern Protestants, became a really powerful, a figure that was used all the time. And so even thinking about that, it's not until really recent that we have pulled the Apocrypha out and said, this is not part of our tradition. So.
Do Catholic Bibles get updates as often as Protestant translations do?
They get updated. Yeah, they're a lot of these updates are, you don't know. They just print them and have some changes and some edits and some corrections in them. But yes, they're not as, they're a little bit more staid in their change.
Sure, that's what you'd expect, I guess.
Although Scott, I heard a rumor from a reliable source, and I haven't investigated it, that there's going to be a Catholic translation of the ESV that's going to be used for their lectionary. Is that true?
Yeah, I've heard that.
I've heard, and I was like, that really struck me as strange for Catholicism to use the ESV.
It's not coming out of the Vatican.
Good. Anyway, that's a whole nother. I haven't investigated that, so I don't have much else to say on it, but I wondered if Scott had heard it too.
I've heard that too, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. So let's hit that speed round of Twitter questions, and just keep in mind, thank you, Twitter universe, for supplying us with these questions. They're amazing. And Beth and Scott, if you don't like any of the questions, remember they came from Twitterverse.
Not our fault. And feel free to be as brief as you want.
You'd be like, I'm not answering that one. Yeah.
We're getting close to our time here, aren't we? Yeah.
Yes. All right.
We'll do lightning round.
All right. So this is a longer question, but doesn't have to be a long answer, I don't think. Related to what we were just talking about, Brian Kavanaugh asks, how can we tell good history from bad? And he specifically mentions his seminary education, leaving out things like Greco-Roman, local gods and festivals, trade guilds, pederasty, different people groups in the New Testament, etc. And he said, I feel like I am now just scratching the surface on what I was told were complete pictures. Any advice?
Right. Read more broadly among historians. Don't simply read your church history textbook that was given to you in seminary. If that's the only place you've learned church history from, broaden, reach out, broaden, find out what other books are out there. And so, I mean, I think that if, there could be, I need to write a resource page. I actually wrote a resource page a long time ago for pastors on the anxious bench, on finding reliable sources. And so maybe I need to revive that and do one also for, finding reliable historical sources and how to know. So, but I would say broaden what you are reading.
Seminary curriculum, seminaries are driven by curriculum. They're driven by ministry sources, and they're thinking of sermons. They are not driven by the historical
Right.
discipline. So most seminaries do not push students into original sources.
Right.
So Josephus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they might mention them, but they're not reading any of it. So a little plug for Northern, both of our programs, the master's level and the D-Min level, we get into ancient sources.
Nice.
Because I know the pastors would like to do it. They'd like to read some Josephus.
Not just the surveys.
Yeah.
Nice. These are longer answers than we need, so feel free.
Okay, we'll go faster.
Any thoughts specifically about the NKJV or the NLT? I know those are very different.
Scott helped translate the NLT. Although I will say that the NLT has variations in its gender response, and maybe one day Scott can illuminate us on that. But whereas it's very good at translating brothers and sisters, it often still returns to, and some of the Pauline texts, it has more of a gender bias. I don't actually know that much about the NKJV. I know a lot about the KJV, but I don't know very much about the NKJV.
Amen. Amen.
All right.
There we go. Here's another one. Why do some translations seem inclusive in some passages, but not in other passages? And any advice for those who've been hurt by the clobber passages?
I think, because different people are involved in translations, and because there are different it's in some places it's innocuous to translate brothers and sisters, whereas in other places, if you make that gender inclusive, it might convey a different meaning. Mm-hmm. So I think that, the stance on women in the church often dictates where gender inclusivity appears in a Bible.
And I would say that they need a variety of translators in order to hear what other people might hear about some of this stuff. Clobber passages, I think, is too difficult to take on.
Yeah, that's a whole episode, really.
Yeah,
we can talk about healing. Later.
Beth, I'm going to limit you to like a 2-word answer on this, because that's how it's phrased. Was the Protestant Reformation overall good or bad for women?
It is neither. The Protestant Reformation changed how women are treated in the church, and how evangelicals then picked up on the Reformation really has driven a lot of our understanding of women's roles in the church. So it's more nuanced than that.
Nice. Scott, this one's for you because it's kind of nerdy. So a couple people mentioned a take on Genesis 3:16 by Susan Foe. Am I saying that right? Foe. And apparently it's been pretty influential in complementarian circles, especially on translations like the NLT and the ESV, which render Genesis 3:16 to say something like, you will desire to control your husband, but he will rule over you. That's the NLT. Whereas the NIV has, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. So apparently her take on that was very influential. Any thoughts on that? Why it's been so influential? Are there scholarly debates about that?
I skimmed this when it came out, and I don't know what Susan Foe is on to. I think Beth probably knows more about this than I do.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons why she was so influential is because she said what people wanted to hear.
Yeah.
She said that essentially the curse isn't patriarchy. The curse is women resisting patriarchy. And that's pretty much what she said. And conservative scholars picked up on that. From what I understand, most scholars who read that you take a lot of liberties with the text. when you do it that way. Actually, Rachel Green Miller has written a great blog about this, and Rachel Green Miller is still a complementarian, and she has written a great response to that article.
All right.
Awesome.
I think we can call that our Twitter round. Sorry if we didn't get to your question.
Yeah. Beth,
Yeah.
you've got a question for Scot?
Oh, well, I could, so one of the things that I often think about when I think about where my journey with Bible translations began, it began with the Blue Parakeet. The Blue Parakeet was really revolutionary to me. It's one of those books that I think a lot of people have read it, but I also think that more people should read it. So Scot, could you tell people, what is it that you argue in the Blue Parakeet that can help us better understand how to read our Bibles?
Okay. I think I use this in the book. I haven't read the book in a while, The Bible is full of what I call wiki stories. And that is, there is, let's say it's Moses talking in Moses's way in Moses's day. And then Isaiah is talking in Isaiah's way in Isaiah's day. And Jesus is talking in Jesus's way in Jesus's day. And Paul is talking about Paul's way in Paul's day. And it is not a systematic theology. It is a developing story in the pages of the Bible that has a goal, the New Jerusalem, and has a beginning. And there are all these progressive moments in it, so that we have to read each author, each text in its own day for what it was doing in the larger picture, rather than turning it into sort of pieces in a puzzle that we have to take apart and find which piece that we can put together, and then we're going to be able to frame a systematic theology. That's not how it works. It is sort of the truth of the gospel, the truth of God coming to expression at different periods, and we get to watch how this thing happens. And when we listen to it well in its context, we gain the capacity and discerning abilities to be able to do the same thing in our world. So that's, and then I was originally going to do 4 topics: gospel, atonement, women, I don't know, something else. And I only got to do the women. I told my editor, I said, this is going to be enough. It's going to sell the book if we can talk about women like this. And so I have a good section. I think about a quarter of the book is on women in the Bible, to be able to see them in light of how this story develops, rather than just some one text that tells you everything about it. So, but that was, for me, one of the most illuminating discoveries in writing, is to watch how women appear in the pages of the Bible.
Right.
And my conclusion was, if you're going to talk about women, I think you need to ask, what did women do, and do you allow women to do in your church what they did then? And I'm reasonably confident that complementarians simply do not permit that to happen.
Man, that reminds me of a question that you, Kyle, cut out from Twitter about prophets in the church in Corinth and how women were prophesying. I kind of want to go there.
Part of that whole story.
Yeah. But what you're speaking to, Scot, is we don't really have a good understanding of the treasures that women were bringing in the church throughout history, that we think we just see it within our pre-modern or postmodern sensibilities. Beth, what kind of influence did that book have for you as you were rethinking women's roles in the church?
Yeah, it really helped me see that I was looking, that the way we understood women in the Bible was primarily through the lens of Paul. And that we were not even through the lens of Paul, through the lens of a handful of verses of Paul in those clobber passages, and that we were reading everything through that lens, including these stories that took place thousands of years before Paul. And in stories that have nothing to do, completely out of context. And so it was causing us, and often what we would do is ignore what was actually happening in those stories, like the story of Hagar, which I only became really attuned to what's going on in that story much later in my Christian life. And I wish I had read that story in of itself without connecting it to the lens of those clobber passages. And so I think that's what it did for me.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So last question, and this might be a simple answer. It might be no changes, forecasted in the future. But as we think about the progression and the evolution of biblical translations through the ages, like you can go back to Jerome, and then all the changes. What do you foresee, but either of you or both of you, in the future of biblical translations? Will there be pretty much a universal gender inclusivity when it comes to putting committees together? Will there be a difference in the way these things are brought about? Will there be a difference in the language? Will there be things that are considered unacceptable now that will be in biblical translations in 50, 100, 200 years from now?
I have an inspired answer for this.
Yes, those are my favorite.
The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior.
Mm.
And so what we will have in the future different versions of what we've got now.
That's boring.
My hope is that we actually are much more attentive to diversity. We need to have Bibles that aren't translated primarily by white people. I would love to see a modern English Bible translation that stems from Black theologians, and see that become much, and even if, I would love to see much more diversity on translation committees, but at the same time, I would also like more texts, more translations that we can use to compare. And so I really would like to be at a place where we can see that, where when somebody asks a question, what's the most diverse translation committee, we can actually tell you more. We can really give you some answers. Yeah.
Yep. That's good. Any just in case you got some names for us, but any names of current theologians who are Latinx or African or African American Black, who are Asian, who are females? Any recommendations on scholars that might take us outside of our norm a little bit?
Stony, The Road We Trod. That's a great compilation.
100 of them. There's all kinds of development in this field today. And it's just sad that a lot of the tribes don't hear the other voices. It's there. It's all there.
Yeah. I would, Stony, The Road We Trod for sure is that was really started my journey on Black theologians. So
second edition just came out.
Yeah. And it's great. I really love that. And so, I mean, even that, and then I think with the expansion, Latinx scholars, I'm less, Kat Aramis has a great book on, Abuelita faith. Yeah. And it really shows, the difference when you look at scripture through the eyes of a brown woman. Yep. And so, I mean, even just, they don't even have to be what we would consider to be credentialed theologians, but just thinking about how texts are received. And of course, one of Kat's arguments is that we ignore all these female theologians who are really acting as theologians, and because they don't have the same type of training or credentials, and don't have the same connections.
Yeah, and because they're not engaging in the dialectic in the same way.
Right, and so we ignore these texts.
She was on the show, so if listeners want to go check out that interview with her, it's really good. I would add to that list Will Gaffney's book.
Oh, yes, Will Gaffney's book.
Really
you put me on the spot, and so I was blanking on. But I've actually written a blog post where I list, it was my response to Christianity Today's scandal. And I said, well, just go read more women. And so I have a response where I have a whole theological, where I pulled up a lot of non-white scholars and historians.
Awesome. All right, we'll put all that in the show notes.
Yeah, if you haven't bought or read Blue Parakeet or A Church Called Tove, or certainly the making of biblical womanhood, go get them now and just enjoy the next month or two of your life. Scot, And Beth, thank you so much for spending time with us again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Yes.
Awesome.
All right.
Alrighty.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Guys.
Cheers.